They will play a role, but it's important not to overwhelm. It's also important to understand how you can make a chart impactful. You need to make them explanatory because those charts will be a visual anchor for the audience. And if they are seeing it together with your voice, they will just absorb it even better than just reading it or listening to you.
Today, we're diving into the art of financial storytelling with Soufyan Hamid. Soufyan is an experienced fp&a professional dedicating his skills to transforming finance professionals into compelling storytellers. In this episode, you will learn how to extract insightful messages, craft clear stories, design impactful visuals, and master your delivery, turning financial data into persuasive narratives. Let's learn how to tell a financial story that captivates your audience. Soufyan, could you tell us more about the concept of financial storytelling and why it's a critical skill for finance professionals to master today?
The first thing that I have to say about financial storytelling is that it's a bit different from the storytelling that you usually hear about. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but generally when you hear storytelling, it's more in the marketing, in the sales, everything that seems to be lying in order to make people believe in what you have to sell. Mm-hmm. Here, in our case, the financial storytelling comes in a more regular way because you have to present your results every month. You have to present your budget in a recurring way, a forecast as well. So it's more in a business environment in which you don't try to hide behind great talks in order to deceive people. The goal here is really to transmit information, to transmit insight, but to make it so relatable that people will be convinced about what you say. And that's what's important and that we often forget in finance is that it's not because we have the financial data behind us that people will suddenly believe in what we say. They will not just be convinced to take action because we present some figures. They need to be convinced because they still take decisions with their guts. And this is where we have a goal. And this is where we have a sort of role. It's to make sure that the data that we analyze will be triggering a decision in the end and an action. And that's the goal of financial storytelling, nothing else.
So it's to garner action from the parties involved. And you mentioned something interesting, and I would love to dive deeper into, is that data may not be enough to convey a message and inspire action. So if for finance and accounting professionals, we do rely so much on data and numbers, right? And we expect people to understand numbers when we present them, like, hey, this is what the data shows, so this is the next course of action. But if that's not enough, how do we infuse storytelling so that we get people's buy-in in terms of the vision we want to present?
Well, it's all summarized in one word. It's the context. You have to know the context of the data. And this is not something you will find in the database. You have to find the business events that happen behind the figures that you have in your P&L, for example. You will have to know the people who will have to take action about this data. You will have to know, of course, the market. You will have to know information that you don't know from your P&L or any driver that you may find in the database. So the context is the additional element that you have to bring in your story so that people will relate. And this is why generally when I teach people financial storytelling, I always tell them to reverse the narrative. When they speak to people, don't start with the figure, start with the business event. For example, just let's say you have a decrease in revenue versus last year. Generally, in 99% of the cases, what people will do is our revenue decreased because, and then they start to explain. My take is start with the event. This happened, and so it led our revenue to decrease with so much dollars. So that's a way for you to put yourself in the shoes of the people in front of you and to reverse the narrative, not in financial, but in business narrative, supported by financial evidence.
That's very interesting. I see what you've done there. You switched the order around. It makes the message more relatable in terms of for all non-financial people, they can understand a business event, right? More so than numbers in many ways. So turning that around is such a great way of doing it. So I do appreciate that. What are the most common challenges for finance and accounting professionals when it comes to financial storytelling?
In the last years, I discussed with a lot of finance professionals and CFOs and finance directors, and I gathered five main issues in financial presentations. The first one is that there's no clear message that people go out of the meeting with. That means that when they have to see a financial presentation, they will have tons of information, tons of explanations, tons of variances. But when they go out of the meeting, they don't have a clear idea of what they have to remember. And if they don't know what to remember, well, they will not know what to do with it. That's the first issue. The second thing that goes along maybe with the third thing is that there's no clear tailoring to the audience. That means that generally we start with the report, we start with the presentation, and generally it's the same slide deck, and we present it to every audience. It doesn't really change whether it's the board, the exco, or a marketing team or a sales team, and that makes it a bit difficult for all to find themselves relate to what you say, because of course the language, if you try to please everyone, you will please no one. So that's the problem of the audience. And that's also the problem of your narrative, which is the third issue that we have in financial presentations. Generally, we follow the structure of our report, and our report is the P&L, the cash flow, or the balance sheet. And so we follow this structure. We go line by line: revenue, cost of sales, direct margin, OPEX, etc., etc. But it's something that speaks to us because we know how a P&L is. But if you don't structure it in a narrative that will trigger the interest of the people in front of you, you will just lose the audience. That's the third issue. And then the fourth one is, and this is something that's known, it's concerning the slides. The slides are too full of text, too full of graphs, too full of KPIs, tables, etc., which make them so full, so crowded that eventually, when they are projected in front of people, they will either start to read, which is not a good sign, or will be disinterested because they will just be overwhelmed. And this is an even worse sign of the effect that you have on your audience. And then the fifth one, which concern a bit less people, because not everyone is meant to go and present their figures in front of audiences. Well, it's the delivery of the presentation itself. Generally, there's less preparation than what's expected. There's no preparation of the questions that will arise. And normally you're able to plan the questions that will come during the presentation. People do not rehearse or do not practice beforehand. And that means that they will start reading their slide. And I call that generally the weather forecast syndrome. That means that they will just be there and show their slides like they are going to show the weather. And it's not giving an effect because you're not connecting to the people. And if you're not connecting to the people in front of you, well, you might as well send an email with a report. It will have the same effect if you're not there to answer their questions, to connect with them, and to convince them with either your engagement, with your eye contact, with your way of speaking, and even with your body language. This is something that people have less and less. And speaking of body language, today, well, since many presentations are given remotely, we have less and less body language available, which will make the work on connecting and engaging with your audience even more difficult. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. So those were the 5 main issues that we have. The first one was the message. The second one was the audience. The third one was the narrative. The fourth one was related to the slides. And the fifth one was the lack of preparation in the delivery of the presentation itself.
As you were describing every challenge, in my mind, I'm thinking, yes, I've had that challenge, all five for sure. And the last one, which is the one that I've seen, and personally also, public speaking is a challenge for many. So joining some sort of club to polish and improve public speaking is huge. So you can address all the 4 challenges, but if the presentation, the delivery is not there, then that takes away a lot of the effort that's been placed into preparing for a high stakes presentation. Am I right?
Basically, that's creating a product that you will not sell, that you will not put on the market, which is a terrible mistake in terms of business. You will not spend your time creating something valuable if you do not show it.
Exactly. Soufyan, those are excellent challenges that you've pointed out. Could we get a little more tactical for those who are listening or watching this video and have never considered financial storytelling before, but are very curious about how they can apply this in their work? They're thinking about, okay, I hear what Soufyan is saying, but what are the tactical steps to move forward? I've got my P&L, my balance sheet, my cash flow, my KPIs. Now, how do I put it all together and infuse storytelling for my next executive meeting? What tactical steps would you advise or recommend people starting out in this area begin with?
I generally say that there are 4 steps that you have to take in order to deliver a great financial presentation. And the first one is definitely not preparing your slides. Mm-hmm. It's really getting the message out of your analysis. And how do you do that? Well, by going further than just informing. You have to not only inform, but also find what makes it relatable to them. So in that sense, I use the 3 what structure. The what is informing, just telling what happened and why it happened with the root causes. Then you go to the so what. And in the so what, you have the possibility to touch the emotions of your audience. That means that you have to know what matters to them, why it's important for them, what keeps them up at night. And only because of that, they will be triggered to take an action. And this action must, I wouldn't say come from you, because in many countries, in many cultures, when finance comes and tells business what to do, it's generally not well taken. It's not well accepted. Mm-hmm. So you come and you bring recommendations in the form of options. What do I mean with that? We are in the now what, and you just transmit some calculations, some options that you assess so that people can take decisions. What does that mean? That means that with your drivers, with your knowledge of the business, well, you will just list a series of items that we can use to compensate the potential loss versus your budget, for example, or to even improve the situation thanks to something you discovered during your work. That means that with these 3 steps in the message, you will be able to touch the emotions of people, which will make them relate to what you say and be convinced about taking action. And you will leave the decision in their hands. So here you touch their emotions twice, because you make it important for them and you give them also the role of the hero, because they took some of your options and they will just apply it. And that's eventually your goal. That was the first step, by creating the message. And after that, you have to create the story. And the story is simply using a structure that will be applicable to either executives who do not have a lot of time, or to experts who will need to be convinced first by proofs before giving recommendations with the conclusions. And only after you manage to have one clear message and that you structured it, you're able to create your slides. This is only the third steps, not the first one, but the third steps.
Mm-hmm.
And when I speak of slides, it's the slide that you will use during your presentations, not especially the ones that you will send before, because what you have to send before, and let's be clear, many companies, if not all, require finance to send a pre-read before.
Mm-hmm.
So you will send your slides before, and generally there's enough to read in those so that people can understand them alone without anyone presenting them. However, if you use the same during your presentation, generally there's too much text, there are many graphs, too many KPIs, and so they are not a great visual during your presentation. So the third step is to prepare visuals that will be following your structure of the story. And when all is done, the fourth step is to prepare yourself. And by preparing, I mean practicing, rehearsing alone or with a camera or with PowerPoint, because there's an option in PowerPoint to rehearse with a coach. So you have so many ways to practice at least once so that you have the feeling that your presentation is going to be great and that you have the words that go along. And I don't mean that you have to know it by heart, but you know your structure. You can correct some elements that you don't find great during your rehearsal or your practice. And you can also think of questions that will arise during the presentation. And that's one of the most important preparation, because no one likes to have unresolved questions during a presentation.
It's very easy to, especially when presenting financial data, to fill the slides with a bunch of information, right? That we think is important for the audience to know. But what I'm hearing you say today is that less is more. So when it comes to presenting data, KPIs, figures, what's the best practice? If on one side it's best not to fill the slide with a lot of information, so how can someone present figures to an audience without overwhelming them?
Well, generally, you have to take a step back and use the helicopter view. In our way, people will either follow the EBITDA, so you will have to follow the bottom line, or the net profit. And in that sense, you will start from that and explain the variations from this bottom line. And what I find important, in order not to overwhelm but to be complete, is to start from the bottom line. And the bottom line is either the EBITDA or the net profit according to the driver that the company uses, because it's the one that people will follow. But it doesn't mean that you have to explain all variations to make the sum of them all and arrive at the total variance. Meaning that if your EBITDA varies by 2 million, it doesn't mean that you have to add every single variance of your revenue, your COGS, your OPEX to arrive at the 2 million. What I also find important in that case is that since you have to focus on the business event, generally those business events have an impact on more than one line in the P&L. So generally they will have an impact on the revenues. They will also have an impact on the cost of goods sold and possibly on the operating expenses, etc., etc. So if you take a business event and add an EBITDA impact on it, well, you're safe not to overwhelm people with explaining every single line with the same items, but explain globally with 2 or 3 business events that have an impact on the total P&L.
Mm-hmm. That's a great approach, Soufyan. So present the number at a high level, and if there are questions, be ready to answer those questions with supporting information, but not throw everything at once as to not overwhelm the audience. I think that's what I heard you say.
Yeah, indeed.
Very good. Awesome. Do you have any example from your personal experience as to how you were able to adapt your presentation to a specific audience that you were going to present for the first time?
It was not a first time, but I presented once the strategic planning, so the 5-year plan to the CEO, and I didn't know him at that time because he was pretty new in that job, but I already saw him in some other presentations. But it was more a marketing presentation. And since he was originally a marketing guy, well, he was interested and had a lot of questions. So I figured out that I had to approach him with a good story, starting from the context and then delivering the end point of the 5-year plan after that. But quickly I realized that he wanted to see the direct picture before. So I didn't change the order of my slides, but I started directly from the total picture. I started by presenting the 5-year plan with the figures, the CAGRs, so that he knew what we were going to do in the next 5 years, and directly also presenting the variance versus the previous 5-year plan. So I understood quickly after 5 minutes that he was becoming impatient and that I had to switch directly to another type of story, type of structure that was more directed to executives that needed to go directly to the point. And that was one event in which I realized that storytelling is important in terms of structure because you can switch directly from the one to the other. There's a story for every type of audience. You can adapt to every kind of audience, but I try in finance to classify them in two audiences. You have the experts and you have the executives. And so the elements are the same. It's just the order will not be the same. So you can quickly switch from one to the other depending on the feelings that you have in the first place. So I will just tell everyone to start with the executive way because it's generally what works best in a business environment and especially in finance. But if you see that people need to be convinced first by the supporting evidence, then you can switch around your story again.
When it comes to slide presentations, we can show tables with data, but we can also use charts, graphs, pie charts, grand charts, any kind of chart out there. So in financial storytelling, how much do charts play a role in when you're presenting and telling a story through numbers?
Well, they will play a role, but it's important not to overwhelm. And in that sense, it's also important to understand how you can make a chart impactful. What do I mean with that? Because we have tons of dashboards in finance, in data works as well. We have charts, we have dashboards, and generally those are exploratory charts. That means that we use them to detect anomalies, to detect outliers, to detect trends. And from that, we start our analysis. The error we make is that we just copy paste those charts and put them on the slides. But in order for charts to be impactful in the presentations, they cannot stay exploratory. You need to make them explanatory. And in that sense, you will have to adapt the layout by coloring some bars or some parts of your line to focus the attention on the data point you want your story to be based on. That means that, let's say you have 12 bars because you work on a 12-month basis. You will have to put the focus on one or more bars that will explain your story, not on every bar. So you will gray out all the other bars you will not speak about and put the focus on it. You will add some explanation on it. You will add some elements that will graphically just point out the data on which you will speak of, because those charts will be a visual anchor for the audience so that they will link the words you're saying to the image they are seeing. And if they are seeing it together with your voice, they will just absorb it even better than just reading it or listening to you. So both have a clear impact on the audience, and that's why you have to play on both.
That's such a good tip, Soufyan. So having almost like a dynamic, if someone's going to use dashboards and charts and graphs for presentation purposes, it's good to make them a little dynamic so that what you're saying ties with what they're actually visually seeing on the screen to drive the point home, right? I mean, a picture is 1,000 words. So putting both together that way is great. I mean, in so many presentations that I've been in, I've seen entire graphs just there and someone was explaining it, but the graph was static. Nothing changed. So it was almost like, what am I looking at? I'm not sure. So your point of helping the audience by guiding their focus to specific elements of a graph or chart as you explain things, I think that's a very powerful way of presenting financial information.
Yeah, that's why I'm also a fan of animations in PowerPoint, for example. If you use animations and transitions, well, a lot of people will tell you it's distracting. You cannot use that in finance. No, it's important to remain simple and sober, but you have to use them in order to put the attention on some points. And this is the dynamism that I want to see in slides, not especially using a dashboard like Power BI and clicking on it during the presentation, because if you do that, that would be distracting. But if you have a static graph on which you will just all of a sudden blur some elements of the slide and just extract the color of one, surrounding it, adding a text, people will see it together. And if you're good enough with a pointer or a clicker, well, you will make it super alive. And that's a way for you to be seen as a great presenter, because you will know your structure. You will know when to speak and when to switch to the next animation, to the next slide, so that people will just see visually when they have to follow you and when they have to follow the graph.
That's an excellent point, Soufyan. Great clarification on how to use effectively charts and graphs and dashboards that are not distracting, but are aiding you in the presentation and delivery of your message. You talked about a couple times during this interview about how important it is to prepare ahead of time for the potential questions that someone will ask you, so that you have the answers to and be able to continue that dialogue. Now, at the very end of a presentation, I've seen sometimes, I'm not sure if this is commonplace or not, but the audience will give feedback to the presenter. So in those type of scenarios, what is the best approach from a presenter standpoint in receiving feedback, in accepting feedback, not getting defensive at times? So what tips do you have for someone who's receiving feedback in a public setting after giving a presentation?
Well, it doesn't happen that often because generally it goes fast. Now, when you have a slot in an exco or a board, well, you have your 20 to 30 minutes, and after that, there's another presenter. But I would associate your question maybe to doubts that people will have on your presentation. For example, they will have doubts on your data. They will just question your conclusions, and they will just not believe you or just challenge you. First thing is that you don't have to take it personally, because generally you have to imagine that people are not mean just because they want to be mean. They have their priorities, they have their thoughts, and so you don't have to take it personally. It's not you, it's the work. So that's a mindset that you have to take. The second thing is that you have to be prepared for questions and doubts. And that's why you have to make sure that you have answers for as many as possible. But in the last resource, in case you have an insisting person who will just have doubts on your conclusion or challenge your conclusions and will just make you pass for an incapable, well, use the boomerang. It's a technique that many people, many presenters use in order to just diffuse the bomb. So if someone is just aiming at you, just decide that it's not for today. you can diffuse the bomb for later, or you can just return, and hence the name of the boomerang, you can return the question back to the person. For example, if someone says that your idea is stupid, let's say it crudely, well, just ask back, what would your idea be? Because we can discuss it now. And that's one of the important points of a presentation in finance is that in the end, when you present your recommendations, when you present your options, you're not in presenting mode anymore. You have to switch to the facilitator mode, facilitator role, in which you will lead the discussion about your recommendations, your options, and the action points that we have to take in order to correct or enhance the situation. And in that sense, you have to work on your skills in order to facilitate a meeting. And that means that you have to be able to give the word to everyone, to engage with everyone, and also to make sure that you're able to diffuse the bomb in case it arises. And the boomerang technique is a good way to do so, because you will not be angry at the person. You will just decide to return the question to someone else. So that's why it's only usable once or twice in a meeting. We just say, what are your thoughts about the topic that we mentioned? Or you can just boomerang it back to the rest of the audience by asking the rest of the audience what are their thoughts about the question that they mentioned. Or you can just decide that you're not armed to do it on the moment itself, and you would just say, let me get back at you with a clear answer, because today I cannot really help you with this. So there are ways as a facilitator to make sure you're not answering when you are warm and when you are hot. It's better to be colded and that you are able to think about your answers.
Yeah, that's a very good tip, Soufyan. The boomerang one is great, but you're right. It cannot be used more than a couple times in a meeting. Otherwise, you're sending questions back, and there's really no dialogue. But it's a good one to keep in your back pocket for those moments when it's really high pressure and you're not sure how to respond to an answer. Another one is the "I'll get back to you after the meeting." That's another great one. And also, you touched on the mind shift of going from presenter to facilitator. I think that's a very important point, because once you change the perception of your role from presenter to facilitator, it's more about having a conversation. It's more about, like, I think, having a productive dialogue versus me here. I'm going to share with you. I'm right. And you just have to listen. So making that shift, I think, is very important and produces, I think, a more cohesive meeting, a more positive meeting. So I love all those tips you've shared, Soufyan. So thank you for sharing that. So we've talked about what to do before the meeting, what to do during the meeting. Now we talked about how to handle challenging questions, or how to handle people who are coming after you with their own thoughts that are completely opposite of yours. But now, do you have any tips or best practices for presenters after a meeting? Is there anything they should be doing after a meeting is over?
Well, clearly, what I want finance professionals to take is the accountability of the meeting. That means that when there's a discussion and there are decisions taken, well, become the one that will make sure that those are actually done after the meeting. That means that there is a follow-up. If there are action points, make sure that you take them or assign them. And that's a way for you to be seen as an accountable professional and an accountable partner that will keep his or her promises, because this is where your credibility will be at play. Presenting is one thing that will make you credible. That's for sure. But if you don't follow up, you're just seen as a presenter and not as a business partner. And that's why following up on the decisions that were taken during the presentation is the key to make you a business partner after that. So definitely the follow-up is the element that will make a strong differentiation.
Very good. Yeah, that's so important. I think that really differentiates people who are doers versus those who are not, is the follow through, the follow up after a very high stakes meeting. So very, very good point, Soufyan. Before we wrap up today's episode, Soufyan, is there anything in terms of financial storytelling that I may not have asked you yet that you think is important for our audience to know about?
Let me think.
But if we've covered everything, I think we've covered quite a bit already. So I think there's a lot.
We covered a lot.
Yeah, so there's a lot of
we covered a lot together.
Yeah,
so,
there are many.
I'm not thinking something directly. Only element that I want to do for finance professionals is to relieve some pressure. I mean, the goal of financial storytelling is not that people become the next TEDx talkers. The goal is not that people will be able to speak in front of thousands of people. Here, the real goal, at least my vision of financial storytelling, is to make sure that as finance professionals, we can make sure that the legend of boring presentations disappear. They will not exist anymore because we are able to make it one of the most important presentations that people from outside of finance will have to attend. That's one of the most important points. And that's why, and that might be my closing point, is I urge CFOs to cascade the presentations to their teams, meaning that it's not only their job to present financials to the board or to the exco. Make sure that every team in the company will have its finance professional who will come every month or every quarter, present the financials. Because that's a way not only for your team to develop these skills and to develop that communication that you will eventually see in the quality of their work, but it's also a way for all the organization to develop their financial literacy and use finance as a tool to better perform. And eventually, that's the way to make sure that finance is not only seen as a back office department, but also as an actionable department.
And for those who listen to that message and are very enthusiastic and want to learn more about financial storytelling, how to develop this skill set, which you've made a great case today that is very important for delivering the right message, for inspiring action by stakeholders. So where can they go to, Soufyan? I know you've been in this space for a long time. You've developed programs and trainings, and they're excellent. So where can we guide our listeners to, our audience, to learn more about this and become better at financial storytelling?
Well, the first step is to contact me simply. So I'm available on LinkedIn and you can easily find me, connect with me. We can have a chat. We can have a discussion, but you can also find all my trainings on thefinancecircle.com. So it's my website in which you have access to my training for groups. So for companies, but also for individuals who want to develop their own skill and not wait for their company to create the whole program. This is where you will find most of my trainings and also free resources. So I have a free training to start with storytelling. I have free resources like cheat sheets or reports that they can use. Definitely, it's the way to go to start your storytelling career in finance.
Excellent. We'll make sure to leave links in the show notes to your website, your LinkedIn profile, the cheat sheets, and any other resource that you've mentioned in today's episode. Soufyan, thank you so much for being on the show. It's great to have you, and thank you for sharing your insights and knowledge about financial storytelling. I'll make sure to direct people to your website.
Thank you, Nathan.